Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Adversary Universe podcast, and this gets weirder and weirder every time we go on video. Adam, I don't know if you think that, but how's it going?
I don't look at it. I try to look straight at the camera so it looks like I'm not also in front of a computer, which is just disconcerting because I see you moving in the bottom, but I'm looking right here. Hi everybody, here I am,
I can't do it.
Just sitting in my room, looking like a weirdo, talking to myself.
Actually, it's funny because a lot of people reach out to me and they go, "Hey, can you guys talk about more bread recipes?"
Oh, I just tried a new one today. I was in Europe last week and I had this amazing bread in Paris, and I tried to replicate it. It's a pan à campagne, which is a country bread.
Really?
Yeah, I had a hard time because I don't really speak French, and I was trying to pronounce it pan à champagne. And probably sounded a little bit like Christopher Walken from the Continental skit from Saturday Night Live. I was trying to ask for this recipe. I was trying to talk to people and using my broken French, and they were just looking at me like I was out of my mind. They're like, "What are you talking about? Champagne bread, pan à campagne." It didn't come out good. So, listeners, I will get you a recipe as soon as I get it dialed in. But this one was pretty tasteless.
Oh, très bien, as they say in France.
It was not très bien.
There's a bunch of services that are being offered, right? They're from, we do it today as a society, right? Everything from shopping services and grocery services and your streaming services. And I know over the past several years, Ransomware-as-a-Service has been something that has been pretty popular. Would love to unpack with you what is going on in the world of Ocular Spider. Let's go through their origin. This is going to be a bit of a compact episode, but really want to hit the mark on who they are, where they've come from. But I also want to reverse a little bit and go into the world of Ransomware-as-a-Service. And when did these as-a-service offerings come out? And how often is that becoming very prevalent in this underground ecosystem of e-crime services that you see?
Yeah, maybe a quick history lesson for those of you that don't know all the ransomware and how it's kind of emerged. So way back when in 2015, we started seeing ransomware, but it wasn't in the form that we see today. So we were seeing, there was a botnet called Game Over Zeus. It was run by this guy, Evgeny Bogachev. And what they were really focused on was wire fraud. So trying to steal bank account credentials to do illicit ACH wire transfers. And it was really a plague for businesses. They were going after medium, small businesses where they could get that ACH information and then start to make wire transfers. But then if they couldn't get that ACH data, they didn't want to waste the effort on that victim. So then they would try to steal credit card information, bank account information, anything else that they could potentially monetize. And then the last possible thing that they would do to try to eke out a couple of dollars, let's say, from that infection was they would push a crypto package. I think it was Crypto Wall, but there was also Crypto Lock. There were two that were prevalent at the time. And what they would then do is they would lock everything on the computer and they would say, give us $300 or you'll never get your data back. And that really targeted individual users. It wasn't going after businesses. Around this time frame, 2016, we started seeing this group called SAM-as, which was actually an Iranian-based group, we later find out. And they started to innovate and they kind of went after businesses. And they said, okay, rather than encrypt one machine and get $300, let's encrypt all the machines and start demanding thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And around this time, we started to see another group take notice, and it was Evil Core, or what we call Ocular Spider. And they had this malware called Dridex that was kind of similar in terms of the fact that in the 2015, 2016 timeframe, they were stealing credentials, bank accounts, credit cards, things like that. And they started to use Dridex to push down a new payload that was called BitPaymer. And that was really the first time that we saw kind of these traditional e-crime botnet operators now moving into the ransomware game. And one of the first ransom demands that they made that really caught people's attention was a healthcare service in the UK. And they demanded, I think it was $10,000 or something like that. They got paid. And this was kind of an eye-opener. And we started seeing more and more criminal groups starting to experiment with this, what we at the time called Ransomware-as-a-Service, but today we call big game hunting. And the first time that we really see an adversary starting to use this as a service, it was the group that became GansCrab was the first ransomware as a service that really kind of became popular and took off. And within a short period of time of launching that and starting to make some money, they actually retired GansCrab. And they kind of said, oh, and this is Pinchy Spider.
Pinchy
and
Spider, I was going to say, yeah.
We had a GansCrab, crab, Pinchy. Anybody wondering how we name things sometimes? It's just that simple.
Just that fun. It's just that too much fun.
Too much fun, yeah. And, maybe it was like a SpongeBob SquarePants kind of day. And so they started to say that, oh, we're retiring. We had a lot of fun. We made a lot of money. And they kind of went away.
Yeah.
And then our evil came out, and we started to see that, there was some similarities between that code. And so now we are at a point where we have this emergence of what would be called ransomware as a service. And ransomware as a service really is where the threat actor they don't actually do the intrusion. They are doing the platform. They're building the ransomware. They're building the tools. They're building all of the things that you might need to make a successful ransomware operation. They just don't actually do the actual crime effectively, right? They're the platform that's used for that crime. And for that, they take 20, 30%. And that was really kind of where we started to see that innovation was this ransomware as a service, because now anybody could get into this game. All they had to do was break into a target, deploy this ready-made ransomware package. The platform would actually take care of the rest of it. And so the victim would get their notification, they'd go to a portal. And when they got to that portal, it would basically tell them that they had to pay the money, that there was, later they would create kind of almost like a negotiation desk where they would handle negotiations.
Oh, wow.
And you as the affiliate or the user of the ransomware as a service, you would get your 80% or 70%, whatever it was. And they'd split it off. They'd take their piece. You'd get your piece, and you were off to the next victim.
So there's a convenience, right? So that now means that you don't necessarily have to be a coder if you're one of these affiliates, right? You're basically just leveraging a service that's out there. You're targeting your respective victims. You're relying on the craftiness of whatever delivery mechanism, I'm assuming, whether it's a phishing attack or campaign or identities that you've probably purchased off of an access broker forum. Is that?
It was not a lot of phishing. We tended to see a lot more, this is where the access brokers really started to become, or identity access brokers became kind of part of the equation, because now it's kind of paint by numbers, right? If you buy access from an access broker and then you deploy GansCrab or later REvil, now you're off to the races. And all you have to do is kind of get the payload to the target where you can deploy it as far as wide as possible. And then from there, we see this explosion of ransomware as a services, where there's kind of two kind of methodologies. You have the core groups, like I mentioned, Evil Core, which we track as Inject Spider, or the TrickBot operators, who were known as Wizard Spider, and they had their own ransomware payload that they would start to deploy, and ultimately several. We'd see groups like Carbon Spider as well, who then started kind of playing in some of that ransomware as a service. And so, now we've got this kind of rich ecosystem of e-criminals who are either operating these kind of ransomware as a service platforms or are running the entire operation end to end. And we actually saw that as ransomware became more and more popular, that even the groups like Indrik and Wizard started getting rid of TrickBot and Dridex because they realized that it was kind of heavy and it was maybe more detectable and
heavy to maintain, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, heavy to maintain. It was a lot of infrastructure where you could just use CrowdStrike now and get the same thing, where they'd build, they started playing with different types of loaders that were built in Golang and later Rust and things like that, so that they could try to avoid detection. And this is kind of how ransomware as a service got to where it is today.
So, but that does a couple of things, right? So it lowers the entry point for really anyone to access these services, because now you don't necessarily need to be a coder, as I mentioned. And so what does that do to the industry, right? Are we just seeing a massive influx of ransomware campaigns that are just being delivered by more ancillary e-crime groups or little clusters? What does that look like?
Well, yeah, it's actually a good point because it makes it kind of difficult for us when we do attribution because we can do attribution to the ransomware as a service,
Yeah.
but it's harder to start to delineate the affiliate users of that service. Now,
Yeah.
there's plenty that we have been able to delineate and we can track. There's different things. Some of these groups have kind of affiliate IDs in some of their tooling that you could use to track it, or the affiliates had distinct enough TTPs that you were able to say, okay, this is affiliate 1 and this is affiliate 2.
Oh, wow.
But it certainly makes it a little bit more difficult. But at the end of the day, as we see with law enforcement and the industry at large, if you target those ransomware as a services and you disrupt them, then you force the affiliates to go find new ransomware as a services that maybe are a little bit newer. And even today, we still see some of these ransomware will have cryptographic flaws or things that we could take advantage of, particularly in their first iterations, and then they kind of figure out how to dial it in a little bit better. So now we've kind of got this war of attrition between the good guys and the bad guys trying to disrupt these things. And we've seen some kind of interesting attempts by the government to even step in. For example, with Evil Core, they had one of their variants of their ransomware that got sanctioned, so effectively got put on the OFAC list.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of was a pretty big escalation where they were telling the victims, you cannot pay if it's this ransomware or this threat actor. And that was done once because the ransomware threat actor effectively just changed the name of the ransomware. And then I think OFAC realized that they couldn't come up with new named entities and new organizations as quick as the adversaries could change the ransomware name. So it kind of became a little bit of a difficult situation for them to be able to try to mitigate. And so they've stopped doing that. But we do still see quite a bit of law enforcement activity aimed at disrupting the infrastructure of some of these threat actors and trying to make it a little bit more difficult.
That's interesting. I wonder if these threat actors feel that because they're only offering those tools as a service, if they aren't susceptible to the long reach of the law, right? And it's really more the affiliates that are basically causing the impact. Like, what do you think is the thought process behind these guys?
No, because I think they're just trying to stay operational. The thing is that most of these folks are in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia, where it's really difficult to get any sort of law enforcement action to disrupt them. The most basic level, the Russian authorities are effectively saying this isn't a crime here because you didn't do anything here, which is why we see a lot of these tools are set to look for the keyboard type or the language on the system, and if it's Cyrillic or any of the kind of Russia and then you're abroad, they don't deploy the ransomware in order to avoid creating problems for themselves. Once they do that, they're kind of crossing the line, and then the FSB may come knock on their door.
That's a fantastic kind of journey through this evolution of ransomware as a service. I think it's fascinating. Let's talk about Ocular Spider. How does Ocular Spider enter the scene?
So Ocular Spider has been around since, I want to say it was April, if I remember correctly, of 2023. And they entered the scene on Ramp Forum, which is one of the underground criminal group forums, and they launched this ransomware called Cyclops. That's why we named them Ocular Spider, right? We try to keep it simple when we can. And so they started off with Cyclops, and ultimately, as that became a little bit more popular and they started to get a little bit more attention, they rebranded, as many of these groups do, to Night, because when they start to get media attention and negative pressure and law enforcement starts to talk about them, they want to kind of move away from their name because that's the one thing that they're tracked by. Similar to GandCrab moving to REvil, Cyclops moved to Night, and last February they launched a new ransomware called RansomHub. They kind of claimed that they had sold the source code for it to try to move the RansomHub aspect away from them as a group, and it really was where they started to get pretty good at what they were doing. We started to see a lot more activity from them, and that's really kind of where the story picks up. They started to create more modular ransomware for various platforms.
Oh, interesting.
So they were really going after the data, right? And that's kind of how much pain can you inflict? And that's really the whole calculus of ransomware, is at what point is it cheaper just to pay to get your files decrypted than it is to keep fighting?
Yeah. No. And which is interesting too, because I know we covered this in a previous episode. I think when we first started this podcast, it was the trending in data extortion campaigns versus ransomware and kind of the combination of the two, right? So where adversaries may steal your data first and then launch that ransomware, and at the end of the day, they're just looking to get paid in some fashion.
Yeah, I mean, there's this concept that we often hear called the double
Double
extortion,
extortion, exactly.
right? And
Yeah.
so I think, we've seen some adversaries pivoting away from even using ransomware, right? Because they figured out that, particularly if you're targeting something like a law firm or a consulting organization or something like that, that they've got a lot of sensitive customer data. And it could ruin the organization if you leak all their customer data. So we have seen threat actors that have gone pure play extortion, but I think ransomware is still something that is pretty easy for them to understand and to operate. And so they kind of, it's a little bit more difficult negotiation, I think, than if it's like, hey, we locked your stuff and you're not going to be able to get it back unless you pay us, versus we're going to expose all this stuff, and if you don't pay us, then you can. I think the negotiation gets a little bit more difficult and nuanced, because they'd be like, all right, well, we'll pay for this data, but we don't care about the rest of the data.
Interesting. All right.
So then the threat actor really needs to be good at understanding what data to target to really hurt the organization, and I think most of them, they just don't have that ability to go through an entire enterprise's worth of data to find the most salacious stuff.
I think AI could help in that, in the grand scheme of things, though, right? I think we're seeing the uses of AI to start analyzing large sets of data, which may be incorporated into some of this analysis that e-crime groups or even nation-state groups are using.
Yeah, and we mentioned it in the Global Threat Report too a few weeks ago, but we're starting to see that threat actors, when they hit a cloud, that all of these cloud services, the big ones, they offer foundational AI models.
Yeah.
And so they're starting to experiment with being able to touch those foundational AI models through Cloud Control Plane once they gain access to it.
Exactly.
And so that's probably, you're a little ahead of the threat actor here. Hopefully nobody's listening. But, yeah, absolutely. I think, and the other thing that I've been thinking about too is that organizations, as they're really moving to adopt AI more and more, that they're going to trust that AI, particularly if it's within their cloud.
Yeah.
And so then if the adversary can really weaponize the AI inside of the cloud tenant, then it's effectively a trusted resource, perhaps with all kinds of crazy access. So
Exactly.
you can imagine asking the local AI, like, hey, what's the most sensitive data that would be completely problematic if it was to leak onto the internet, and where is it located?
Yeah. I'm actually doing an entire talk at RSA 2025 on securing AI, by the way. And so...
Oh, you have to let me know. I'll try to attend.
Yeah. And for those of you...
Not in back-to-back meetings in the chaos of RSA.
Yeah, I know. It's going to be pretty nuts.
The other thing I'd say is kind of how do they gain access to these ransomware-as-a-service? Because you can't just roll up and be like, hi, I'd like to do the ransomware now, and get accepted. So some of them have a buy-in. And so, you could either, some of the ways that they can gain access to, in particular, RansomHub and some of the stuff from Ocular Spider, there's really a couple of paths, right? One is that you have some clout on some of the underground forums, and you're well regarded, so they're going to let you in. Because the thing is some of these ransomware-as-a-service platforms are also competing for who's the best affiliate, who's going to do the most damage and make them the most money. So that's one way. If they have previous ransomware-as-a-service creds to Knight or to Cyclops, then perhaps, that would get them access, or they could potentially buy in. There's, I think, a $5,000 buy-in to this one, and you'd still have to go through and kind of demonstrate that you're the real deal, but that's kind of how they maintain access to their platform. And then they have VIP affiliates versus regular affiliates. So if you're a VIP affiliate, smash that like button and subscribe type of thing, and you'll get access to new features and to kind of the better dashboards and early builds of the new tools and things like that.
Oh, so you have so it's like a full platform service then, where they, as an affiliate, you can measure the success of your program and your campaign via.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like a business, right? It's
wow. Yeah.
George Kurtz, when we first started talking about this years ago, he's like, oh, it's revenue sharing, and I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. It's this is fascinating. I know you actually made this comment earlier on our inability to sometimes provide attribution for some of these, for the affiliates, right? Because they're sometimes acting independently or in smaller clusters. But what does it take for here at CrowdStrike in terms of the naming conventions and the attribution that we provide? What does it take for a group to go from activity cluster to like a named adversary? Like how's that tracked?
Well, it's really just about how frequently we're seeing them, because we see ransomware come and go all the time.
Sure.
So, it's about the number of cases. In this particular group, we've seen 536 named victims by Ocular Spider between 2024 February, when they first launched RansomHub, and March of 2025. Second only to Lockbit in terms of number of victims. And they've targeted professional services, technology, healthcare, manufacturing, heavily focused on the US, and then Canada, Brazil, some of the European countries. So they're pretty widespread in terms of how they operate. And I think we've seen a pretty good view of who's involved. There's about 20 or so members that we're tracking related to Ocular Spider. There's, people like, I won't go into some of the specific names, but we've got some of their handles and we're able to kind of get a sense of what they're up to. And kind of their leader is responsible for they get about 35% of the cut. One of the brokers gets about 10% of the cut. The team member gets 50% and Ocular Spider gets 5% overall. So
oh, wow.
They've got a pretty complex breakdown and who gets what in the payouts.
Oh, wow. That is pretty complex, though, in terms of that ecosystem.
It is.
Like a big distribution model that they have there. And like you said, a lot of payout. Wait, there's more.
Because just a few weeks ago, we've started to see that there's a little bit of a twist in April, actually, which is just getting underway.
I like a plot twist.
This new group, Dragon Force, came out, and they claim that Ocular Spider was migrating to their infrastructure because their infrastructure has been down since March. There was some stuff that went down, and we've seen a new dedicated leak site, or DLS as we call it, a negotiation platform that mimics some of ransomware branding. So Ocular Spider has not confirmed that this is happening, but we're seeing a lot of speculation into whether there was a hostile takeover of the RansomHub, or it was a voluntary pivot, or what's going on. So, this is a story that's continuing to emerge. And, this is a threat group that if they're not locked up, I mean, they, between October 2023 and March 2025, got paid $11.6 million based off of our calculations.
Wow.
15 or so Bitcoin addresses that were affiliated with them. They're making tracking very difficult of this, of course. But, I think it's important to note that this story is continuing to evolve. And so we're keeping a close eye on what else happens with that, because unless, as I said, Ocular Spider is disrupted by law enforcement, RansomHub is going to be a player. They've got brand reputation. People know who they are, and it's modular, it's scalable, it's adaptable, and it's weaponized software as a service.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. What do you want to share with our listeners in terms of how do the defenders deal with this massive increase in, these ransomware ecosystems that are out there, especially with Ocular Spider activity, just kind of changing the ransomware market, the ransomware game, right? Making it that easily accessible.
The first thing is you got to be a hard target, right? And that's the number one thing, that adage: you don't have to be faster than the bear, you just have to be faster than the guy next to you. And so doing security well, making sure that you're a hard target, making sure that you're, one of the things that we talked about from the Global Threat Report, and I think it's really important to note, is patching. We've seen that adversaries have kind of recognized that a lot of organizations patch by criticality based off CVSS score. And we've seen that kind of in recent months that the adversaries are chaining together multiple vulnerabilities. And I wouldn't say that they're doing this deliberately to avoid the CVSS score. I think it's probably just that they're figuring out that this works. But, imagine, an organization patches on criticality. They go off of what is the severity of the vulnerability in many cases. And when you think about chaining of multiple vulnerabilities together, you might have an unauthenticated bypass type of situation where threat actor can have unauthenticated access to a server because of some flaw, or to an unmanaged network device because of some flaw, and they gain access to it. And then they also find a local privilege escalation. Now, if you had an unauthenticated privileged access, that would definitely be a higher criticality than if you have two vulnerabilities that kind of split across that. And so the impact is that organizations aren't maybe patching some of these things as fast because they have a lower criticality score. So one of the big takeaways that I talk to a lot of folks about right now is use intelligence to patch based off of what threat actors are exploiting. There's two vulnerabilities, for example, in a very popular VPN software right now that's being pretty readily exploited by threat actors. And one of them had a CVSS score of 5. One of them had a CVSS score of, I think, 7. And, many of the orgs that I talk to, when I talk to them and ask them, what's your threshold? They kind of are like, yeah, we'd like to say that a 7 would hit the threshold, but it doesn't always. So, one of the approaches that I would advocate is say, like, hey, let's take a look. Who's targeting our vertical? Who's targeting our geo? And what vulnerabilities are they exploiting? Let's patch those first.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Patching always seems to be such a hot topic with every customer and enterprise I have conversations with. It's all about trying to figure out prioritization. It's about understanding which systems are exposed, which ultimately lead to a higher likelihood of those systems being impacted by a very specific set of vulnerabilities or exploits that have been designed for those vulnerabilities. And then there's also a concern on how AI has expedited the delivery of those exploits for said vulnerabilities, right?
Well, I don't know that AI is playing enough of a role right now as much as
sure. I think the concern is still out there. Yeah. I think the concern
it's coming.
Yeah.
But right now, I don't know that we've really seen that. I think right now what we're seeing is that threat actors are really just feasting on identity issues across organizations. So the two kind of most prevalent ways that threat actors are getting in is that they're either finding vulnerabilities in unmanaged devices, right? Your VPN concentrators or remotely accessible services. And this isn't true only of e-crime. This is true of China and Russia, North Korea, Iran, like you name it. They're going after these unmanaged devices because one, they're often not patched. They're finding lots of vulnerabilities, things as simple as directory traversal and things like that. And then they're unmanaged, so nobody's watching them. And so if they gain access to it, they could live there undetected for a period of time. And then a lot of these devices are being used for authentication, so they can sniff valid credentials out. And today, as we've talked about with cross-domain threats, you start with the identity and then you pivot almost immediately into the cloud control plane because most organizations aren't going to be able to track you there.
Exactly.
And then from the cloud control plane, they can pick which targets they want to go after. They can use, like Azure run commands to deploy ransomware or remote monitoring and management tools. And ultimately, the goal being to find that hypervisor if they can, which is effectively the primary target. That's like the 2-meter hole on the Death Star that, if you... I don't know if you've seen Star Wars or not.
I have seen Star Wars.
Yeah.
No, that's right.
But that's kind of the way that it goes. So I think you got to get identity threat detection and response in place. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah,
you need to be looking at the cloud control plane and being able to instrument that and look for any anomalies there using cloud native application protection protocols. You need to be able to use cloud security posture management, cloud workload protection. You need to be looking at Docker containers and things like that as well, and Kubernetes, because these threat actors are really becoming very enterprise aware, and they know how to operate in a modern enterprise. So, all of those things paired with intelligence and having an intelligence-driven, patch management is going to put you in a much better position to be faster than the guy next to you.
Absolutely. No, these enterprising adversaries are very resourceful, and they understand the control plane a lot of times better than even their victims do. So I think it's
unfortunately that's really the case, and I think a lot of orgs still have the enterprise team looking through the straw, and they don't see identity, they don't see cloud, they're only looking at the endpoints.
Exactly.
And then if they have an identity team or if they have a cloud team, their responsibilities are different. So making sure that the security operations team has that visibility is crucial. Yeah. You can't run, don't walk right now to make sure that that's happening.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So more to come on that, and hopefully we have some of those updates posted on our blog in terms of Ocular Spiders, where they end up essentially infrastructure-wise. So that's fascinating. Any closing words for our listeners, Adam? I thought this was
stay safe out there. There's a lot going on, and we're continuing to track this stuff and put out new intelligence reporting on this every single day. So we'll keep an eye on it, and maybe we'll follow up in a future episode of the Adversary Universe podcast.
I like that. In a world where ransomware is so easy to get access to, comes a man with one desire to stop them. Adam Myers. We'll figure the rest out. You heard it here first. So then I'll see you at RSA. And,
we'll be at RSA. If you're out there, come hit us up. I think we're going to be doing some Adversary Universe stuff out there for sure.
This was really good. I appreciate these conversations all the time.
Always fun.
And we need some guests. We have a line of guests that we're just working through the cycle. And can't wait to bring them on to talk some good stuff. Again, let us know. We've said this on previous episodes. If you do have some ideas or topics you'd like for Adam and me to get into on the Adversary Universe podcast, we are more than open to hearing those ideas. Hit us up on LinkedIn. Stop us at the grocery store. If we're at a conference, you name it, we're happy to hear that feedback. And we're happy to incorporate that into our producer notes. So thank you so much. This is the Adversary Universe podcast. Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You got it, man. We'll see you.
Always a pleasure, Cristian Rodriguez, Field CTO of the Americas.
All right, we'll catch everyone on the next episode. Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.